The dog stopped at the edge of the marsh behind the weathered cul-de-sac, its snout frozen over the torn fabric it had unearthed, and the officers, once casual, felt the air turn dense with the certainty that this quiet neighborhood had long hidden something irreversible beneath its hush now revealed. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The marshland behind suburban Charleston homes had always been treated as a harmless backdrop, an expanse that collected humidity, mosquitoes, and the muted drone of cicadas each summer. It bordered Picard Lane, a row of modest single-family houses built in 1989, each with identical siding, trimmed hedges, and the persistent sound of lawn equipment on weekends. This was not a place residents associated with crime, much less a disappearance that would grow cold for over 2 decades. Yet on June 3, 1997, a call from a distressed neighbor about a family dog returning to the yard with something that looked like fabric but smelled wrong changed everything. The missing person report had been filed exactly 4 days earlier. 22-year-old college junior Michelle Hart had been last seen leaving her part-time shift at the Market Street bookstore where she worked. Surveillance cameras were grainy, the tape aging poorly even by mid-90s standards, but it showed her locking the storefront at 9:03 p.m., the fluorescent sign flickering behind her as she crossed the sidewalk to her small sedan. She never made the 10-minute drive back to her apartment on Calhoun Street. Her roommate reported her missing the next morning after discovering Michelle's bed untouched, her purse absent, and her work apron still crumpled by the sink. Police handled it as a possible voluntary disappearance for the first 48 hours, invoking the standard reasoning of the era. Adults had the legal right to leave without explanation unless evidence pointed to coercion, foul play, or mental crisis. Charleston in early summer carried a haze that softened corners and prolonged scent, trapping it in the air like residue. When officers approached the marsh behind Picard Lane on June 3, they found the disturbed earth that the dog had been pawing at. The fabric fragment recovered was consistent with the blouse Michelle had been wearing in the final video frame from her workplace camera. It was blue, cotton, slightly torn but not violently shredded, stained with soil and the faint trace of biological decay that brought certainty more than shock. The canine unit was deployed within hours, the area cordoned off, and detectives from the Charleston Police Department Major Case Unit assumed immediate control. Michelle's parents arrived from Columbia that same evening. The press lingered along the periphery of the block, respectful but persistent, repeating the same brief facts for nightly broadcasts. A missing college student, personal belongings recovered near a Marsh, police withholding speculation. The story spread quickly across South Carolina newspapers, especially because Michelle had worked at a central downtown bookstore known for its academic clientele. She had been well liked, never in legal trouble, with no known interpersonal conflicts beyond standard student frustrations. The marshland excavation proceeded cautiously. Forensic teams layered plastic sheeting, photographed every inch of soil, and measured depth variances. The possibility of flooding had been considered, as high tide occasionally crept beyond expected boundaries. It was during the 3rd day of work that partial remains were located, not exposed dramatically, but discovered inch by inch in a manner that emphasized procedure, not spectacle. There was no need for imagery beyond the technical language included in the coroner's eventual report. What mattered was confirmation. The dental records matched Michelle Hart. The missing persons inquiry transitioned into a homicide investigation. The autopsy report completed on June 9 provided restrained but definitive conclusions. No extensive trauma, no indications of prolonged suffering, and no signs of substances that would point toward self-harm or overdose. The cause of death was identified as asphyxia by ligature, precise, but without lurid description, consistent with a controlled, deliberate act. Time of death was estimated to be within 6 hours of her leaving work. Clothing fragments found with her were cut, not torn, suggesting removal by instrument rather than environmental wear. There were fibers present not belonging to her own garments, beige synthetic threads later connected to an automotive interior upholstery common in mid-90s compact sedans. The neighborhood behind the Marsh became central to the inquiry, not because Michelle had any documented ties to it, but because of proximity. The dog that found the fabric belonged to a household closest to the narrow path where construction crews had once dumped fill material. Interviews with homeowners were structured, recorded, and cross-checked. One family stood out only for their location, the Wiltons, who had moved into 12 Picard Lane 3 months prior. They were not considered suspicious at the time. Their background checks revealed nothing significant, yet their property line abutted the very section of Marsh where the evidence was recovered. The case stalled by autumn, leads dissolved. Forensic testing in 1997 lacked the advanced DNA profiling that would emerge in subsequent decades. The beige automotive fibers were logged, cataloged, and stored with chain-of-custody precision, but no comparative database could trace them back to a unique vehicle. The public attention faded by winter, replaced by newer headlines. Michelle's family held a quiet memorial. Her college department published a brief acknowledgement of her absence, and the file moved to cold case storage by 1999. Time, however, remains a silent investigator in unresolved crimes. In March 2018, a grant allocated to Charleston's Cold Case Division provided funding to re-examine evidence with modern techniques. Michelle's file was one of the first selected due to preserved materials and the relatively intact condition of clothing fibers. The beige synthetic threads were submitted to advanced polymer analysis. The report that followed identified the exact manufacturer and production range for the upholstery. A 1995-1997 run used specifically in a single model of compact sedan, a vehicle sparsely purchased in the Charleston region. The Department of Motor Vehicles records from that period listed 6 confirmed owners in the county. 5 were ruled out. 2 vehicles had been totaled years before the homicide. One belonged to a woman living out of state by 1997. One was sold to scrap the year Michelle vanished, and one was registered to a dealership fleet with no record of private use. The 6th belonged to a name documented in the original canvassing records but never considered critical: David Wilton, homeowner of 12 Picard Lane. By 2018, Wilton had relocated twice, eventually settling outside Savannah. Detectives reached out through official channels, the tone procedural rather than accusatory. When questioned regarding his ownership of the vehicle during the summer of 1997, he admitted to having sold it privately in 1998, unable to recall the buyer. His answers were brief, polite, and dotted with memory gaps that fell within acceptable limits of time. Yet the renewed focus prompted a review of his property records from that period, including building permits and contractor logs. A significant detail emerged. Wilton had filed a request in late June 1997 to have a section of his backyard drainage adjusted, citing erosion from the marsh. The work completed involved filling and regrading an area not far from where the dog found Michelle's blouse fragment. Detectives ordered a second forensic dig, relying on ground-penetrating radar to avoid unnecessary disruption. The scans indicated irregular soil compaction consistent with prior excavation. When samples were taken from deeper layers, trace fibers matching Michelle's blouse were recovered, along with a length of cord containing partial DNA. The testing, while meticulous, produced a mixed profile, but digital advancements enabled extraction of a major contributor. The strand matched David Wilton with statistical certainty, aligned to courtroom standards. The arrest warrant was issued in November 2019. Wilton, then 52, was taken into custody without incident. During interviews, he maintained silence, invoking legal counsel. The prosecution built its case on physical evidence, timeline proximity, soil disturbance records, and the automotive fiber analysis that finally bridged the forensic gap. There was no need for dramatization. The courtroom proceedings lasted 12 days. The testimony composed of methodical forensic explanation and the quiet grief of Michelle's family revisiting facts with controlled dignity. In March 2020, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The sentencing was delivered in restrained language, acknowledging both the duration of unresolved grief and the absence of any demonstrated motive beyond opportunity and control. Wilton received a 40-year term with eligibility for parole review after 28 years under state guidelines. The aftermath was subdued, reflective of the case's tone from its first discovery moment. The marsh behind Picard Lane was cleared of investigative equipment, the soil restored, and the dog whose instinct had initiated revelation continued its days without awareness of history. Michelle's family declined extensive media requests, choosing instead a small scholarship fund in her name at her former college department. The Cold Case Division marked the file resolved, not as a triumph but as a necessary closure that had waited for science, persistence, and the quiet accuracy of evidence to converge. There were no commemorative broadcasts, no anniversary specials, just a folder thick with decades of careful documentation stored in a climate-controlled archive of the Charleston courthouse. A case once suspended between humidity, silence, and unresolved absence had been concluded through the same steady equilibrium that defines real investigative work: routine, patience, and the eventual certainty of truth discovered not through spectacle, but through the unspoken persistence of records kept and questions never abandoned. The news cycle moved on quickly after sentencing, leaving only the procedural residue of courthouse transcripts and archived broadcasts stored in regional databases. Yet the lasting impact of the case existed not in headlines, but in the individuals who had spent years maintaining its presence within departmental memory. Cold case investigators often speak of unresolved disappearances not as failures but as suspended obligations, files waiting for the technological moment in which silence becomes interpretable. Michelle Hart's case, once buried beneath newer priorities and emerging crimes, became an emblem of how time can aid justice rather than erode it. The Charleston Police Department reviewed their archival system after the conviction, acknowledging that while no procedural errors occurred in 1997, the limitations of that era's forensic landscape contributed to the prolonged uncertainty. Polymer fiber analysis had simply not existed at the level required to isolate the automotive upholstery. The DNA collection methods of the late 1990s focused on blood and hair, not trace cord fibers sealed beneath compacted soil. Cases of Michelle's kind, solitary adult victims without immediate suspects or dramatic forensic scenes, often faded not out of neglect, but because the era lacked the necessary interpretive tools. Thus, the 2018 reinvestigation was not an act of redemption, but of continuation. The Hart family remained private, yet their interactions with investigators reflected sustained courtesy and composure, a tone consistent throughout the decades. After the trial, they requested the return of certain personal belongings recovered during the excavation, including the fragment of blue blouse discovered by the dog. The item was released under strict evidence return protocol, sealed within archival-grade packaging. It was not displayed, photographed, or referenced publicly. Its significance was familial, not symbolic. Charleston residents reflected differently on the marsh behind Picard Lane. What was once a neutral edge of the subdivision now held the weight of recollection. Local planning authorities eventually approved a restoration effort intended to stabilize the soil and rehabilitate native marsh grasses. The project's language made no direct mention of Michelle or the case, yet the quiet implication of respect was embedded in its funding justification. Preservation of land affected by past investigative disruption. Work crews completed the restoration in early summer 2021, leaving behind a space indistinguishable from its pre-1997 state, save for those who understood what had been uncovered beneath it. Wilton's legal appeal was filed automatically, as is standard under South Carolina statutes involving felony convictions with significant sentencing. The appellate brief did not contest forensic evidence itself, but argued procedural concerns about the timeline of evidence retrieval. The state responded with detailed chain-of-custody documentation tracing every transfer, from the initial 1997 soil cataloging through the refrigerated evidence vault, where items remained under serial logging. The appellate court affirmed the original ruling without oral argument, concluding that the law had been applied correctly and that the integrity of the forensic process remained intact. There was no single investigative breakthrough that could be labeled decisive. Rather, the case demonstrated an accumulation of precision, the preservation of fabric fragments beyond expected degradation limits, the careful logging of automotive fibers long before their relevance could be understood, and the unaltered recording of property line alterations initiated by Wilton after the crime. Each element existed independently for years, inert in the absence of contextual linkage. Only when technological methodology matured did the sequence cohere. The marsh soil, once merely damp ground at the edge of suburban lawns, became a layered record of action, concealment, and eventual accountability. Outreach programs within the Charleston Police Department began to use Michelle's case as internal training material, not for dramatic retelling, but to emphasize evidence storage discipline. Investigators were reminded that materials which appear inconsequential in one decade may become decisive in another. The beige fibers from the sedan would once have been dismissed as generically manufactured upholstery remnants. Instead, they became a forensic fingerprint of a specific production run sold to a small pool of local buyers. The law's progression often relies not on revelation but refinement. The bookstore where Michelle worked no longer exists. The building on Market Street was remodeled in 2012, its interior converted to a cafe and specialty retail space. No visible marker references the missing persons case once associated with it. Yet long-term residents still recall the months of uncertainty that followed her disappearance. The flyers printed on matte paper and stapled to lamp posts, the local news anchors delivering restrained updates, and the subtle shift in community vigilance. In small cities, disappearances linger differently than in sprawling urban centers. There is less anonymity, less distance between ordinary life and investigative presence. The neighbor's dog, though central to the discovery, remained only a footnote in official records. Its actions were documented as canine alert behavior, a term devoid of narrative flourish. It encountered fabric because the soil composition shifted after summer rains, not because of instinctive pursuit of evidence. Yet this mundane chain of environmental circumstance triggered an investigative path that would eventually correct the historical record of a life cut short. Even in forensic work, outcomes often originate from routine occurrences rather than extraordinary intention. Legal closure does not equate to emotional restoration. Families of homicide victims often describe resolution as relief without recovery. Michelle's parents maintained a quiet residence in Colombia after the trial. They released one printed statement through their attorney, thanking investigators for persistence and requesting privacy. No follow-up interviews were conducted. The scholarship created in Michelle's name awarded its first academic grant in fall 2021 to a literature student with concentration in archival studies. The selection criteria mirrored Michelle's academic trajectory while avoiding memorialization as spectacle. Within Charleston's cold case files, several other investigations benefited from the procedural reassessment initiated after Michelle's case was reopened. Evidence dating back to the early 1990s underwent recataloguing, and humidity-controlled storage improvements were funded using state-level allocations, justified partly through the Hart case outcome. The city recognized that climate plays a tangible role in forensic preservation. Marsh air, salt exposure, and seasonal dampness require rigorous environmental control to maintain evidentiary integrity over decades. The Picard Lane neighborhood continued its quiet suburban existence. New residents moved into the Wilton property, unaware of its investigatory past unless they researched deed records. Real estate disclosures followed state law, providing necessary information without elaboration. Neighbors reported that the house remained typical: trimmed lawn, seasonal decorations, and neutral siding indistinguishable from the homes around it. The Marsh path behind it, once subject to forensic gridding and measured excavation, returned to its status as an unremarkable edge of development, visited mostly by egrets and wind. The regional court that heard Wilton's trial archived its records digitally and in print, ensuring long-term access. The sentencing memorandum, while standard in phrasing, included acknowledgement of the case's historic duration. Judges rarely comment beyond legal language, yet here the emphasis on timeline underscored the weight of delayed closure. Jurors, whose names remained sealed as per policy in homicide cases involving long-term community familiarity, were thanked in an official notice for their service. Their participation marked the final civic contribution in a process that spanned 23 years. No annual memorials were instituted by the city. No statues, plaques, or dedication benches appeared. The absence of public tribute was intentional, aligned with the family's request for quiet continuity. Documentaries and televised reenactments sometimes sought access to case files but were denied. The narrative of Michelle Hart's disappearance and rediscovery existed not as serialized entertainment, but as a sober record within legal and forensic history. The closing of a cold case does not produce celebration. It yields administrative finality. Boxes resealed and moved from active evidence shelves to solved case storage, digital tags updated from pending to concluded, and investigators shifting their focus to the next unresolved file. Yet the significance remains. A young woman who vanished during a routine shift in a bookstore, unremarkable except in the impact of her absence, was restored to the factual ledger of accountability. The system, over time, delivered what it was designed to provide: recognition, documentation, and lawful consequence. Michelle's case lingered because it occupied the intersection of quiet suburbia and delayed forensic capacity. It was unadorned, lacking sensational context, and therefore emblematic of the thousands of disappearances whose solutions depend solely on persistence rather than prominence. In the decades between her disappearance and the resolution, Charleston grew, waterfront districts expanded, and tourism increased. Yet amidst those changes, a file remained in climate-controlled storage, waiting until science allowed its completion. Resolution did not rewrite the past, but it affirmed its record. The facts finally aligned stood as the only fitting memorial, a timeline corrected, a perpetrator identified, a family given the truth withheld by years of technological insufficiency. The Marsh, the neighborhood, and the courthouse each returned to their quiet roles, carrying forward without ceremony. No sound marked the conclusion, no crowds assembled, no banners hung. Only the settled recognition that the unanswered question of June 1997 had at last been answered by steady, unembellished forensic certainty. The file's closure left behind a paper trail defined not by drama but sequence. Intake sheets, forensic logs, soil sample imaging, fiber comparison charts, storage room humidity readouts, and the eventual judicial record. This administrative footprint formed the final shape of a case that never sought public amplification beyond its obligation to be resolved. Michelle Hart's life, distilled into dates and evidence markers within a courthouse archive, remained intact in the only format the investigative system can preserve: verifiable record, not narrative reconstruction. Local journalists occasionally reference the case in retrospective articles about cold case methodology, but each mention was brief and clinical. There were no extended features or serialized podcasts. Instead, Michelle's story served as shorthand for the incremental refinements of forensic science, a marker in time demonstrating how silent evidence can hold firm long beyond its immediate interpretive era. Articles noted that nothing about her disappearance aligned with high-profile tropes. She did not live a double life, did not maintain secret connections, did not provoke envy or suspicion, and did not cross paths with organized criminal networks. She simply closed a bookstore one June night and did not arrive at her destination. The minimalism of that transition from ordinary to absent became the defining feature of the case. In internal training briefings, investigators used Michelle's timeline to illustrate a central principle: the location of evidence often precedes its meaning. The Blouse fragment, discovered by a domestic pet, initially suggested proximity but could not articulate cause. The beige fibers, extracted from compacted dirt, remained neutral until technology matured enough to decode them. Even the regrading permit filed by Wilton existed independently of suspicion for years, until the context of vehicle upholstery and cord DNA reoriented it. Cold cases, the division emphasized, are not dormant, only incomplete. The Charleston marshland, restored and stabilized, continued its seasonal cycles. Salt air drifted through cordgrass, the tide rose and withdrew, and the soil, once sectioned and sifted by forensic grids, returned to quiet saturation. Wildlife reclaimed familiar patterns. The path that had carried investigative teams, equipment crates, and plastic evidence tarps now bore only the intermittent print of joggers and maintenance personnel. A passing observer could not detect any disruption in terrain or history. This surface invisibility aligned with the case's character, a resolution achieved without spectacle. In 2022, the South Carolina Forensic Science Symposium cited the case in a panel discussing advancements in polymer differentiation. The presentation was direct, technical, entirely devoid of narrative framing. It focused on the statistical rarity of the upholstery batch, the degradation resistance of synthetic fibers in marsh conditions, and the reliability chart produced during the final laboratory run. Michelle's name appeared only in the citation footer beneath the case number. Specialists present noted the precision of the chain of custody record, describing it as exemplary given its multi-decade span. To those outside the profession, these details might appear impersonal. To forensic analysts, they signified respect. Public memory of the case advanced toward quiet dissolution. Most residents of Picard Lane at the time of Michelle's disappearance had relocated. New occupants treated the marsh as simple landscape, neither ominous nor reflective. Real estate brochures highlighted school zoning, porch space, and proximity to grocery centers, never referencing the restoration project that stabilized the terrain. The house once owned by Wilton received standard market photographs, bedrooms staged with neutral decor, kitchen counters uncluttered, and backyard views looking outward toward reeds and tidal grasses. Absence of reference constituted its own form of closure. Michelle's former college advisor, interviewed privately by a university archival researcher in 2023, described her academically as consistent, thoughtful, and methodical. The advisor did not speak of tragedy, but of coursework, a paper Michelle had written on early American print culture, and her quiet reliability in arranging shelf categorization at the bookstore. The archival transcript was stored within the institution's library oral history collection, labeled simply, Hart, M. Academic Remembrance. It served not as eulogy but as professional record. Wilton entered the routine of incarcerated life without public comment. His file reflected standard disciplinary notes, intake processing, and required counseling sessions. The correctional system reduced his presence to identifiers: inmate number, sentence length, projected review date. The legal determination rendered him no longer speculative but documented. There would be no interviews, no confessions, no retrospective reckonings. The court had already defined the limits of interpretation. Guilt established through articulated evidence and corroborated procedure. For Charleston law enforcement, the case became a benchmark not for notoriety but perseverance. When new detectives joined the cold case unit, the Hart file was introduced early, a reminder that resolution may arrive far outside the immediacy of urgency, that accuracy outlasts momentum. Investigators who had begun their careers when Michelle first vanished had since retired. Their notes, written in ink now slightly faded, remained preserved in climate-controlled storage, a direct bridge between past and present methodology. Handwritten margins, once mere working annotations, became historical forensic data points. Academic criminology departments occasionally reference the case when discussing environmental evidence preservation. Marshland decomposition rates and soil moisture retention charts were compared with actual recovery timelines. Students studied the effect of tidal delay on fabric decay, the role of anaerobic layers in DNA protection, and the incremental erosion patterns along suburban marsh edges. Michelle's case, recontextualized through technical examination, joined the broader educational framework without ever transforming into spectacle. The absence of annual media revival underscored a rare outcome in true crime documentation: closure without narrative inflation. There were no serialized retellings, no dramatized reenactments, no investigative personalities revisiting the marsh with camera crews. The case, though resolutely solved, remained defined by the restraint that marked its earliest reporting. Even digital-era interest never fully materialized. Michelle's name appeared in databases exactly where it belonged, within the solved homicide index, not trending history. The final entry made in the Charleston cold case ledger simply noted, "Case concluded, forensic and legal objectives fulfilled." The phrasing was concise, devoid of sentiment, Yet within its brevity existed the weight of 23 years of uncertainty corrected. Investigators filed the closing documentation, logged the evidence transfer back to archival storage, and moved forward. The work continued as it always does, shifting to other open files, other names, other unsolved disappearances waiting for a technological key yet to be invented. In this quiet closure rests the significance of Michelle Hart's case. A young woman whose absence disrupted no national narrative and whose identity was never amplified beyond the borders of her community was nonetheless carried forward by the system designed to speak on her behalf when she no longer could. The marsh, the dog, the fibers, the permit, the cord, each an ordinary detail absent of dramatic shape, became the structural components of resolution. Justice, when it arrives without spectacle, resembles administration more than catharsis. Yet for those who maintain investigative archives, who monitor climate control gauges in evidence vaults, who log fibers and soil samples without certainty they will ever matter, Michelle's case remains a validation. Time did not erase her, it clarified her. The record stands, the file rests. The system, steady and unadorned, performed its eventual function. Acknowledgement, documentation, and lawful answer to an absence that once lived only in quiet suburban humidity at the edge of a Charleston marsh.